Why do millions of people on entirely different continents keep describing the exact same dream on the exact same week? Ask that question honestly, without reaching for the easy answer first. Coincidence explains one person. It doesn't explain a pattern showing up on every continent, in every language, among strangers who will never meet. Something is moving underneath the news cycle you scroll through every morning, something the headlines describe without ever naming correctly. You've felt it, whether you've said it out loud or not. The world doesn't feel like it's simply having a difficult year. It feels like it's shedding something, the way a body runs a fever right before it finally breaks. Wars flare in places that seemed stable for decades. Currencies wobble overnight for reasons officials struggle to explain convincingly. And underneath all of it, something else is happening. Quieter, stranger, harder to point at directly. People who never ask spiritual questions in their life are suddenly asking them at 2 in the morning, staring at a ceiling that offers no answers. Co-workers who used to talk about nothing but sports and weather are bringing up dreams, déjà vu, a persistent sense that something is about to shift. This isn't a trend somebody manufactured for engagement. It's closer to a symptom, spreading in a pattern that has almost nothing to do with geography. Here's the discomfort worth sitting with instead of rushing past it. If chaos were only chaos, it wouldn't be waking anyone up. Random disorder doesn't tend to produce widespread spiritual searching all at once, across unrelated populations. Ordered disruption does. And the difference between those two, random collapse versus a designed unraveling, changes everything about how you should be reading the events unfolding right now. Most people watching the news feel the temperature rising, but they mistake the fever for the disease itself. They think the goal is simply to survive the disruption, to wait it out until things return to whatever normal used to mean. That waiting is exactly the mistake worth naming plainly, tonight, before going any further into this. Because normal was never neutral. Normal was a specific arrangement, built carefully, maintained deliberately, and it kept a very particular kind of forgetting in place. A forgetting about scale, about who you actually are, about what's actually watching this unfold from outside the noise of daily survival. There's a term for the intelligence some traditions describe as long-standing observers of this planet's development, present since long before recorded history began keeping track. Whatever name you give that presence, the function described across very different cultures stays strangely consistent. Watching, occasionally intervening, waiting for a threshold that seems, by every account, to finally be arriving now. Listen. That claim demands scrutiny, not blind acceptance, and it deserves exactly that scrutiny before you decide what to do with it. But scrutiny doesn't mean automatic dismissal either, especially when the pattern being described lines up so precisely with what you're already sensing, privately, in your own body, on nights you can't explain to anyone around you. Here's the part almost nobody names correctly when they talk about global upheaval. It was never really about the events themselves, the wars, the collapsing currencies, the strange weather nobody can fully account for. Those are the visible surface. The actual mechanism operates underneath, in attention, in belief, in what an entire species has quietly agreed to accept as the outer edge of the possible. And that mechanism doesn't ask permission before it starts working on you. You're already responding to this shift right now, tonight, whether you've named it consciously or not, reaching for comfortable explanations instead of sitting with what's actually unsettling you. Here's where this needs to slow down for a moment, because the instinct to reach outward for an explanation, toward the stars, toward some distant civilization, toward forces entirely separate from you, misses the actual location of everything being described. This doesn't begin somewhere out there, arriving to rescue or disrupt you from a distance. It begins inside your own attention, in the quiet decision about what you're willing to consider possible before you've even finished reading a headline. What people call awakening is, underneath the language, simply a mind finally noticing patterns it spent years agreeing not to see. Without noticing that difference, the whole subject stays abstract, distant, something happening to the world instead of something happening through your own perception of it. I put something together for exactly the moment you're in tonight, and I want to explain honestly why it matters right now. What you're sensing isn't paranoia, and it isn't simply exhaustion from doom scrolling. It's the early edge of a recognition that the usual explanations for global events have quietly stopped being enough for you. I invite you to download the digital book I prepared for you, The Great Spiritual Game Hidden Behind Your Consciousness. Because a single video can point toward this shift, but it can't walk you through the full structure sitting behind it. Inside those pages, the connection between global upheaval and personal perception gets laid out clearly. What's actually shifting? Why so many are sensing it at once? And what it asks of you personally, not as a bystander, but as someone already inside the pattern. This isn't speculation dressed up as certainty, and it isn't another list of predictions to wait on nervously. It's a map, built for people who sense correctly that something larger is moving and want the structure underneath the feeling. The link is waiting in the first pinned comment below this video, ready whenever you decide to look. Read it slowly, without rushing toward conclusions, and notice which parts feel less like new information and more like something you already suspected quietly, on your own, long before tonight. You close that thought for now, but it doesn't fully leave you, and that lingering is worth paying attention to instead of brushing aside. Because once you accept, even provisionally, that global disruption might be mirroring something internal, a harder question follows right behind it. If the shift is real, why do so many people, including you on certain days, quietly resist letting it in? Here's where the pattern gets uncomfortably personal, faster than most people expect. You scroll past a piece of unsettling news, feel a flicker of something larger stirring, and then immediately reach for a joke, a distraction, anything to close the door before it opens too wide. That reflex feels like coping. It isn't. It's a rehearsed retreat, so practiced it no longer registers as a choice at all. You tell yourself you're staying grounded by not getting carried away with all of this. You call it being realistic, being sensible, refusing to fall for whatever's trending this month. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes, underneath that reasonable-sounding caution, there's simply fear wearing the costume of good judgment. Listen, groundedness and avoidance can look almost identical from a distance, but only one of them keeps you exactly where you already are. Real groundedness lets new information in and adjusts. Avoidance filters new information out before it can touch anything, then congratulates itself for staying calm about nothing changing at all. Pause for a second here. Notice your chest. Is it open, breathing easily, or slightly guarded, as if bracing against something before it's even arrived? That guarding isn't random. It's a decision your nervous system made a long time ago, and it's still running quietly, still active right now, while you sit here listening. This is the mechanism almost nobody names correctly when they talk about resistance to change. The mind doesn't reject expansion because it's stupid or lazy, or it rejects expansion because, somewhere earlier in your life, an idea that big once felt disorienting, even dangerous, and no update was ever issued to say the danger had passed. Think about the moment you first heard something like what's being described tonight, years ago, maybe from a stranger, maybe from a book someone handed you. What did you do with it? Most people laugh it off immediately, reflexively, before the sentence even finishes landing. That laugh isn't always mockery. Sometimes it's the fastest available exit from a feeling too large to sit with comfortably in that instant. You've done this yourself, somewhere, at some point, dismissing an idea too quickly, not because you examined it and found it lacking, but because dismissing it felt safer than holding the discomfort of not knowing yet. That isn't a character flaw. It's a mechanism, and mechanisms can be studied honestly, without turning the study into self-punishment. If you're still here, past the point where the easy jokes usually kick in, that isn't nothing. Something in you already suspects there's more worth examining here than a quick dismissal would allow. And that suspicion is exactly the beginning of the shift this whole conversation keeps circling back toward. Let's go deeper into how this resistance actually operates, because the surface behavior, the joke, the scroll, the quick change of subject, is only the visible tip of it. Underneath, there's a quieter calculation running. If I take this seriously and I'm wrong, I'll feel foolish. If I take it seriously and I'm right, my whole sense of what's stable just changed. Either way, the mind flags it as risk, and risk gets minimized by default long before curiosity gets a real vote. So you stay in the comfortable middle, interested enough to keep watching videos like this one, late at night, alone. Cautious enough to never quite let it change how you actually move through your days. That middle ground feels safe. It also means nothing ever really shifts, no matter how many hours you spend absorbing information that never gets permission to land anywhere real. Here's where the difference between genuine discernment and disguised control becomes worth naming clearly. Discernment asks careful questions and still moves forward when the evidence holds up. Control disguised as discernment asks the same questions forever, using each one as a new excuse to postpone any actual movement at all. You've likely met both versions in your own circle. The friend who challenges an idea and still shows genuine curiosity about where it leads, versus the friend who challenges everything reflexively, using skepticism as a permanent wall instead of a temporary filter. One sharpens understanding. The other one simply protects the same unchanged position, indefinitely, dressed up as intellectual rigor. Notice what's happening in you right now, in this exact moment, while you weigh how seriously to take everything said so far tonight. Some part of you is deciding quietly whether to let this actually mean something or to file it away later, as interesting content, and move on unchanged. That decision, made in seconds, is the entire mechanism this section has been describing, happening live, inside you, as you listen. Here's an uncomfortable truth worth sitting with, instead of deflecting immediately. This resistance isn't happening to you from some outside force keeping you asleep against your will. It's a loop running in your own attention, reinforced every time curiosity gets overridden by the comfort of staying exactly where you already stand. Think about the last piece of unsettling global news that actually reached you, fully, instead of sliding past. Did it stay with you for hours, quietly working on something underneath conscious thought, or did you manage to distract it away within minutes? That answer tells you more about your actual relationship to change than any personality quiz ever could. This is where the ground shifts again, so stay with it a moment longer. You don't need more information about world events. You've already consumed more headlines this year than most people absorbed in an entire decade a generation ago. What's missing isn't data. What's missing is permission, granted from somewhere deeper than curiosity alone, to actually let what you already sense be true. And here's a question worth holding in silence rather than answering out loud immediately. If everything described tonight turned out to be accurate, if the disruption really is orchestrated toward a threshold, if the watching presence really has been present all along, would the version of you sitting here right now know what to actually do with that? Or would some old practiced discomfort quietly shrink the revelation back down to something manageable and easy to ignore by morning? That discomfort has a name, and it isn't confusion, and it isn't lack of intelligence. It's the friction between the scale of what's actually unfolding and the identity you've built around staying small enough to remain comfortable inside a familiar version of reality. If you've made it this far, past every reflex built to turn you away early, that isn't accidental. Not everyone stays present for the part where the language stops offering comfort and starts asking something of you instead. And if this is still landing, you're already standing somewhere different from where most viewers give up and scroll on. That's where this goes next. Not into more evidence to weigh, not into another list of events to track nervously on the news. Into the deeper structure underneath all of it. Who you've quietly decided you're allowed to become inside a world that's clearly no longer holding the same shape it held even a few years ago. Who you're allowed to become isn't decided by the size of the events unfolding around you. It's decided by something quieter, something that operates whether the world is calm or visibly unraveling. Call it the ceiling you've placed, without ever consciously choosing it, over what feels possible for someone like you specifically. Here's the simplest way to describe it, without dressing it up in anything mystical. Identity is just the story your mind keeps repeating about who you are, so consistently, in so many ordinary moments, that it stopped sounding like a story and became something you mistake for fact. Facts don't get questioned. They just get lived inside, quietly, day after day. This is exactly where wanting and believing split apart from each other, even though most people treat the two words as interchangeable. You can want to be someone who meets this moment fully and still not believe, underneath that wanting, that such a role was ever actually available to you. Desire lives in imagination. Identity lives somewhere older. Somewhere imagination has to request entry before it's granted anything real. Think about the people who seem to move through disruption with unusual steadiness, almost as if they expected difficulty and simply built a life sturdy enough to hold it. It was never really about luck or temperament or having fewer problems than everyone else. It was about which of them had already decided, long before the disruption arrived, that steadiness belonged inside their identity rather than outside it, waiting to be earned later. Listen. Hoping to handle a crisis well and expecting to handle it well are not the same internal posture, even though they sound similar out loud. Hope reaches toward an outcome that might or might not arrive, negotiating with uncertainty the whole way there. Expectation already lives inside the outcome, calm, almost bored by its own certainty, unimpressed by the noise trying to shake it loose. Here's a small, ordinary example, because this pattern hides best in ordinary moments rather than dramatic ones. Someone mentions casually that you seem unusually calm, given everything happening in the world right now. Watch what happens in the half second before you respond. Some people simply receive that observation, others deflect it instantly, insisting they're actually falling apart underneath, as if calm itself needed defending against. That reflex isn't humility, it's identity, quietly protecting its current shape against information that doesn't match the file it's already holding about who you're supposed to be. You've done this yourself, somewhere, in some area of your life, without necessarily noticing it happening in real time. It isn't a flaw worth punishing yourself over. It's a mechanism, and mechanisms can be studied calmly, the same way you'd study a pattern in someone else's life instead of your own. The mind isn't sabotaging you here. It's staying coherent, because holding two contradictory ideas about who you are creates a specific, uncomfortable friction that most people will do almost anything to avoid feeling directly. That friction shows up right after something unusually clear happens to you, a moment of calm you didn't expect, a piece of insight that arrived faster than confusion could catch up to it. Instead of trusting it, there's often a flicker of suspicion, as if clarity itself were somehow too easy to be legitimate. That flicker is coherence, pulling you back toward the story it already believes is true about your capacity. Pause here for a moment. Notice your breathing and let it slow down just slightly. Ask yourself honestly, when insight arrives easily, do you trust it, or do you brace for the confusion that surely has to be coming to correct it? That bracing isn't wisdom, even though it's very good at wearing wisdom's expression convincingly. Here's the part that tends to reorganize everything once it's actually understood clearly. Reality isn't only responding to what's happening globally, it's responding to what feels familiar to you personally. And in moments of large-scale disruption, those two things often diverge sharply, in ways most people never examine closely enough to notice. If you've stayed with this past the point where distraction usually wins, some part of you already suspected this before tonight gave it clear language. That isn't coincidence. It's what happens when something true meets a mind that was already circling this exact question quietly, on its own, long before finding the words for it here. Let's go further, because identity isn't only belief, it's rehearsed familiarity, built through repetition until it feels less like a choice and more like weather you've simply learned to live inside. You didn't decide once, cleanly, that overwhelm was your default response to large events. You lived through enough moments that resembled overwhelm, closely enough together that your system quietly filed the pattern as reliable, something to expect again rather than something to question. This is why simply trying harder to stay calm rarely holds for very long under real pressure. Trying operates in the conscious mind, the newest, most recent layer of the whole system. Identity operates underneath it, older, faster, largely indifferent to whatever your conscious mind has recently decided it wants to project outward to others. Here's where all of this starts to reshape how you understand what's actually unfolding globally right now. It was never only about tracking events accurately from the outside, waiting to see how they resolve. It's about which version of yourself your system has quietly filed as familiar enough to meet this moment. Because familiar is what gets reinforced, regardless of how much accurate information you're consciously absorbing in the meantime. This is exactly why some people can read every article, follow every development, and still respond to disruption with the same old panic they've always defaulted to. The information was never the problem. The mismatch between information and identity was. You can know the facts thoroughly and still meet them from an identity that was never updated to hold what the facts are now asking of you. Real change here doesn't begin with consuming more news, more predictions, more urgent warnings about what's coming next. It begins with smaller, stranger moments. Noticing the flicker of suspicion when clarity arrives too easily. Noticing the reflex to deflect calm as if it needed excusing. Noticing the quiet discomfort right before you're about to respond to something differently than you always have before. Not everyone catches this the first time it's said plainly. Most people hear, "Your identity shapes how you meet this moment," and nod along, then go back to refreshing headlines, waiting for the world to hand them permission to feel differently. If something in you just sat up a little straighter at that sentence, that reaction alone puts you somewhere different from where most viewers are still sitting right now. Here's something worth being honest with you about, because pretending otherwise would waste both of our time tonight. A single video, however clear, can describe the shape of what's unfolding. It cannot walk you through the actual patient work of rebuilding an identity sturdy enough to hold it. That work has sequence. It has structure. It has specific ways of recognizing familiarity before it hardens back into fact. And I built exactly that inside, the great spiritual game hidden behind your consciousness. I invite you to download that digital book now. I prepared it specifically for the moment you're standing in tonight, not as a general overview of world events, but as a working structure for meeting this exact threshold from somewhere steadier than panic or denial. It goes further than any single video could into how identity actually forms under pressure, how it gets mistaken for personality, and how it quietly negotiates with every piece of unsettling news before you're even consciously aware a reaction was chosen. This isn't a collection of predictions to track anxiously. It's the missing layer underneath everything you've already been sensing and never quite had language to hold steady. The link is waiting in the first pinned comment, the same place it's been since this conversation started. What you've felt tonight, that quiet recognition that something larger has already begun, whether you're fully ready for it or not, isn't something to wait out passively. It's already moving. The only real question left is whether you meet it from an identity built to hold it, or let it pass by, filed quietly back under too much to think about right now. There's a sensation worth naming before anything else here, because this next part isn't only conceptual. You'll feel it first as a slight pressure behind the eyes, the kind that shows up right before something reorganizes rather than breaks. Let it stay there a moment before reaching for explanation. Everything discussed so far has stayed close to behavior and identity. What you do, what you've quietly decided is true about your capacity to meet this moment. There's a layer underneath even that, closer to how information about the world actually reaches you in the first place, before identity ever gets a chance to react to it. Call it a lens, not a belief system, not a personality trait, the actual shape through which raw global events get filtered before they become the story you tell yourself about what's happening. Certain traditions give that lens a name, a presence, an intelligence positioned outside ordinary human timekeeping. Set the mythology aside for a moment and look at the function underneath the costume instead. Whatever you call it, its job is precise. It decides what gets through clearly, what arrives distorted, and what never lands at all, because it doesn't match the shape already carved into your particular channel of receiving. Here's why naming it matters practically, not poetically. Vague language keeps vague confusion in place. The world feels chaotic, explains nothing, and changes nothing about how you respond to it. My lens distorts anything that threatens my sense of stability before I'm even aware of receiving it. That's a mechanism. Mechanisms can be worked with directly. Vague feelings can only be endured indefinitely. Pause here for a moment. Feel your shoulders. Are they lifted, braced, holding tension for news that hasn't even arrived yet today? Lower them deliberately, right now, and notice how much effort that actually required. That effort is the lens, mid-operation, doing exactly what it always does. Quietly, automatically, without asking permission first. Everything named so far. The reflexive joke at unsettling news. The identity too small to hold what's unfolding. The deflection of calm as if it needed excusing. None of it was separate information. It was the same lens, showing up in different rooms of your attention, wearing different clothes each time, so it wouldn't be recognized as the same visitor returning again and again. This is where the whole approach quietly changes direction. Most people, once they sense disruption accelerating, respond by trying to do more. More research, more preparation, more effort thrown at controlling an outcome that was never fully within reach to begin with. That instinct is understandable. It's also, in this specific case, almost always the wrong move. And here's the precise reason why. You don't need more input about the world right now. You need less contradiction inside your own response to it. Every calm intention held, while the lens still filters for danger, creates two competing signals fighting inside the same narrow channel. And the lens, loyal to its oldest instructions, will side with the older signal nearly every time it's given the chance. Say that part again, slower, because it tends to undo years of anxious information gathering in a single sentence. It's not about consuming more. It's about no longer working against your own steadiness in the same breath you're trying to build it. Stop contradicting the stability you're asking for, and it finally has somewhere real to land, instead of colliding with its own opposite the moment it arrives. Here's a question worth actually answering, not just letting pass by. In the last week, how many times did you feel a moment of genuine calm about the state of things, only to immediately undercut it with a thought like, but it's probably about to get much worse? That second thought isn't neutral commentary. It's a direct instruction, delivered to the exact same lens that just received the first, calmer signal only seconds earlier. This is where intensity gets mistaken for readiness, and the two deserve to be separated clearly. Intensity is loud, constant vigilance, dramatic predictions, emotional spikes that feel important in the moment and exhaust you completely by evening. Stability is quiet. The same simple, uncontradicted steadiness, held day after unremarkable day, without needing a crisis to justify its presence. The lens doesn't respond to intensity nearly as strongly as most people assume it does. It responds to consistency, to a signal that shows up the same way, whether the headlines are calm or alarming, whether the room around you is anxious or still. A quiet, stable signal held across months will outlast a loud, intense one held across 3 panicked days, without exception. If you've noticed yourself steadying rather than tensing through this section, that's not a small thing to overlook. Not everyone stays present for the part where the language gets more precise, less dramatic, more like mechanics than prophecy. If this is landing clearly for you, you're already standing somewhere different from where most viewers remain, still waiting for the next alarming headline to confirm their fear. Here's the part that tends to reframe everything discussed tonight once it's actually understood at this level. What's unfolding globally was never simply an external event to track and react to from a safe distance. It's closer to a frequency held locally inside your own attention that the lens then reflects back to you as the specific shape your experience of this era ends up taking. That reframing changes what you actually do next, practically, starting tonight. You stop scanning outward compulsively, hoping enough information will finally produce the safety you're looking for. You start noticing where, right now, in this ordinary evening, you're contradicting the steadiness you claim to want. And you simply stop doing that, one contradiction at a time, without needing a dramatic turning point to mark the shift. This isn't for everyone listening, and that deserves to be said plainly instead of softened. Most people will hear this and find it interesting, then return tomorrow to the same anxious scanning, unchanged, because actually holding a steady lens costs more than simply understanding the concept intellectually ever will. Understanding is the easy part. Living from stability is the part almost nobody follows through on consistently. That's where the next layer opens, not into more explanation of the lens itself, but into what it actually costs you, specifically every time you let contradiction run the show instead of catching it early, before it settles into something harder to name and even harder to undo. The cost of letting contradiction run the show doesn't announce itself in a single dramatic evening. It accumulates the way static builds in a room, unnoticed until the moment you finally reach for something and feel the shock of it. A week of scanning anxiously for bad news doesn't feel unusual while you're inside it. A year of the same habit starts to feel like personality, like simply who you've become in this particular era. This is worth naming plainly, because vague spiritual language tends to soften exactly what should stay sharp here. Contradiction has a price, and the price is presence, the specific, unrepeatable kind, spent bracing for disasters that may never arrive instead of actually living inside the days you currently have. That isn't guilt. It's arithmetic, and arithmetic deserves honesty more than comfort tonight. Think about someone you know who says constantly that they've made peace with whatever's coming, that they're spiritually prepared, that fear doesn't touch them anymore. And yet somehow every piece of unsettling news sends them straight back into the same frantic messaging, the same sleepless scrolling, the same certainty that this time it's finally real. From outside, the pattern is obvious within minutes. From inside, it feels like each event is somehow different from the last one. You've probably been that person yourself, in some corner of your own response to all of this. Maybe not headlines, specifically. Maybe money. Maybe health. Maybe the quiet dread that shows up right before checking your phone in the morning. The area matters less than the shape, and the shape stays consistent. A stated peace, running directly against an unspoken alarm, with the alarm quietly winning nearly every single time it's tested. Here's what alignment actually means here. once you strip away the aesthetic language surrounding it. It isn't a permanent state of serene detachment from world events, and it isn't pretending catastrophe couldn't possibly touch your particular life. Alignment is simpler and less glamorous than that. It's the absence of active contradiction between the steadiness you claim and the private scanning you keep doing in the background of an ordinary Tuesday. You don't need to feel blissfully unbothered to be aligned. You need to stop actively feeding the fear you say you've released, in the small, unnoticed moments that never make it into the version of yourself you present to others. That's a lower bar than most spiritual content suggests. And it's also a far more honest one you can actually meet repeatedly without needing constant reassurance to sustain it. Pause for a moment here and notice your hands. Are they resting, or are they slightly curled, holding tension for news that hasn't even reached you yet tonight? Release them deliberately, and notice how unfamiliar that release feels if you've been braced for a long stretch without fully realizing it. Here's a consequence rarely discussed openly, because it's uncomfortable in a way most content about this era avoids. Every month spent in contradiction doesn't just delay your own steadiness, it reinforces the belief that steadiness was never really available to someone living through times like these. The delay becomes its own evidence, feeding back into the fear that caused it, tightening the loop instead of loosening it. That's the part worth sitting with honestly, without flinching away too quickly. It isn't only that the fear persisted, it's that the persistence itself became proof, in your own mind, that calm was never really possible for you specifically. And that proof gets cited every time steadiness shows up, looking slightly too easy to trust fully. If you're still here, past the point where comfort usually ends and honesty usually starts costing something, that isn't coincidence, and it never has been tonight. Something in you decided, before this video even started, that it was finally time to stop managing the fear and start actually examining what's underneath it. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from managing contradiction instead of resolving it. You felt it. The tiredness that has nothing to do with how much sleep you got. The kind that shows up after a day where nothing physically demanding even happened around you. That's not information overload. That's the cost of holding two opposing signals steady at once, hour after hour, without letting either one fully speak. Most people misdiagnose that exhaustion as simply being an anxious person living through anxious times, as if temperament alone explained it fully. That diagnosis is comforting, and it's also almost always incomplete. The exhaustion isn't from caring too much about what's happening. It's from claiming peace while simultaneously rehearsing disaster in 100 small, unexamined moments across a single ordinary day. Here's where the body enters this conversation directly, because none of this stays purely mental for very long once it settles in. Contradiction held long enough doesn't just tire the mind. It settles into the jaw, the shoulders, the space just beneath the sternum, the places where tension has nowhere else left to go once the mind stops metabolizing it consciously. This is not for everyone listening tonight, and that needs saying plainly instead of softened for comfort. Most people will hear this and quietly find it interesting, then return tomorrow to the exact same scanning, unchanged, because actually resolving it costs something intellectual understanding alone never asks of you. Understanding is the inexpensive part. Living differently is the part almost nobody follows all the way through. If something in you just resisted that sentence slightly, good. That resistance means it landed somewhere real, not somewhere abstract and easy to nod past from a safe emotional distance tonight. Here's the new layer worth adding to everything already said. Alignment with this particular moment in history isn't a single decision made once and maintained automatically afterward. It's closer to a practice, repeated in small, unremarkable moments, mostly invisible to anyone watching your life from the outside. Nobody applauds you for noticing a fearful thought and quietly choosing not to feed it further. Consider what changes, specifically, Once contradiction stops being your default response to unsettling news. Decisions stop requiring so much internal debate, because there's no longer a second panicked voice arguing against the calmer one in real time. Global events stop feeling like they require constant tracking, because the tracking itself was often just compensation for a steadiness that wasn't stable enough to hold on its own. This is where urgency finally deserves to enter the conversation honestly, without manipulation attached to it. Not urgency borrowed from a countdown or a limited window closing somewhere far away. Real urgency, the kind that comes from doing simple math about how many more months you're willing to spend financing the same fear before finally addressing what's actually underneath it. That math is yours to do, quietly, tonight, away from this video entirely. Nobody else can do it for you, and no single video, however clear, can walk you through resolving years of rehearsed alarm in the space of 20 minutes. What it can do, what this conversation has been doing since the very first question, is make the pattern visible enough that pretending not to see it finally stops feeling honest. There's a specific kind of relief that arrives once contradiction gets named clearly instead of vaguely sensed underneath everything else. It's not celebration. It's quieter than that. Closer to finally setting down something heavy you'd forgotten you were even still carrying through every headline you've read this year. That relief is where the next part actually begins. Not with more explanation of what's wrong, but with what it actually looks like to meet this specific era differently, starting from wherever you happen to be standing right now, tonight, without waiting for the news to calm down first. Meeting this era differently doesn't start with a decision made in a single dramatic instant. It starts smaller than that, quieter than that, almost too ordinary to register as the beginning of anything significant. You simply catch one fearful thought, once, in real time, and choose not to feed it further. That's the entire mechanism. No dramatic turning point required. Let's gather what's actually been said tonight, not as a summary to skim past quickly, but as a shape worth seeing whole for the first time. There was never only chaos happening out there, waiting to be survived until things returned to normal. There was a shift, real and ongoing, met by a lens that decided long ago what counted as safe to receive. There was resistance dressed as caution. There was an identity too small to hold what's actually unfolding. And underneath all of it, one single mechanism, repeating itself in different disguises so it would never be recognized as the same pattern twice. Here's something worth feeling honestly before this closes. None of this was ever really about predicting exactly what happens next in the world, event by event, headline by headline. It was about attention, where it rests, what it's decided to call dangerous, what it quietly stopped questioning long before tonight ever gave it language. Change attention's relationship to what's unfolding, and your entire experience of this era reorganizes itself, without needing the world outside to slow down first. You came into this video carrying a familiar unease about everything shifting around you, and by now, that unease has a shape it didn't have an hour ago. It has a mechanism. It has a location, not out there, not only in the headlines, not only in forces entirely beyond your reach. It lives in the quiet architecture of what you've decided is possible for you to hold steadily, and it has been running there, mostly unexamined, for longer than you've had words to name it clearly. Here's the part that tends to stay after everything else fades, so let it settle rather than rushing past it. The world isn't simply falling apart. It's being interrupted by something older than the current headlines, still active, still asking something specific of everyone sensing it at once. And what gets interrupted can, eventually, be met clearly, not through more information, but through noticing, repeated calmly, without needing the noise to quiet down first. That sentence isn't comforting in the soft way most closing lines try to be. It's precise in a way that doesn't leave much room to look away afterward, And precision, once it lands, tends to stay lodged somewhere you can't easily dislodge it again. You'll notice it tomorrow, in some small moment, when the next unsettling headline tries to slip past unquestioned the way they always have. That noticing is the actual work. Everything else was only ever preparation for that instant. At its core, this was never only about what's arriving next on the world stage. It was about how you're already perceiving what's sitting right in front of you tonight, long before the next headline arrives, to test whether anything has actually changed in you. The link is waiting in the first pinned comment beneath this video, exactly where it's been since this conversation started. I want to be honest with you about something before you close this tab and let the night carry you somewhere else. Material like this rarely stays available for long, not because of manufactured scarcity, but because what's written in those pages tends to unsettle narratives that plenty of people have a quiet interest in keeping exactly as they are. And knowledge like that has a long documented history of being pushed quietly out of view whenever it starts spreading too widely. Don't wait for calmer headlines to arrive before taking this seriously, because they won't arrive dressed any differently than the ones you've already read tonight. You didn't reach this exact sentence by accident, and some part of you has probably already sensed that, even if you haven't said it to yourself directly yet. Read with an open mind, without rushing toward the final page just to say you finished it. Let certain lines sit longer than others than you expect them to. And if something in there reaches a part of you that's been sensing this quietly for a long time, leave one word in the comments below. Desperto. Not as performance, not for anyone else watching. Just as a quiet signal that some part of you was ready for this long before tonight ever gave it a name.